So get started with our next speaker. So we have Justin Forbes, who'll be presenting on how to frustrate a penetration tester. A little bit about Justin. So Justin Forbes is the team lead of the Applied Network Defense team at CMU/SCI CERT. He has been leading penetration testing teams for the past 5 years, targeting federal, state, local, and critical infrastructure organizations. Justin earned his master's in telecommunications from the University of Pittsburgh in 2010 and his bachelor's in information sciences in 2008. His typical Permane Brothers order is the Ragin' Cajun chicken sandwich and a tall icy light. I'd say that's a pretty solid combo if you ask me.
No egg on that one.
Oh, I'm with you. No egg is the way to go. Alrighty, so without further ado, let's welcome Mr. Justin.
Thank you very much. It's good to be here. So this talk is going to be about how to frustrate a penetration tester by doing the right thing security-wise. Pretty often when we're doing tests, we end up just doing the same things over and over, and for the past probably 3 years, the same techniques have worked, I would say 90% of the time in the organizations that we go to. So I just want to run through a lot of those common techniques and ways that you can counter those. First, disclaimer, all the statements that you're about to see are mine and mine alone. They do not represent my employer. They do not represent anyone around me. Don't implement anything I'm recommending without actually figuring out if it's going to affect the business first. Patching's great, but certain systems you should not just automatically patch. So you want to make those decisions after consulting with the system owner. I might swear. I don't really know. I'm going to be telling some stories, and there may be some swearing involved. There's lots of memes, so if you can't handle those, you probably want to leave now. And the last disclaimer, I'm very tired. I actually just got in at 4 a.m. this morning because my flight from Chicago was super delayed, so I have not had much sleep. So, continuation of my introduction. So I am the team lead for the Applied Network Defense team at SCI, CMU, CERT. We have a bit of a branding problem. We don't really know who we are. We're a little bit of everything. I'm also now teaching the ethical penetration testing class at CMU. So if anyone is enrolling in the master's program there and wants to take that, I will probably be a good teacher, I hope. So over the past 5 years, I've been leading teams doing penetration testing. I've done 50 plus assessments now all over the United States. Earlier this year, I was in Hawaii. I haven't been to Alaska yet, but I really want to go, so I'm hoping we get an assessment up there sometime soon. It's been 8 years of beard growth. Everyone always, the most common question I get, every restaurant I go to anywhere is, I gotta ask, how long has it been? Always worded that exact same way. It happens everywhere. And then the last point, I'm still learning and failing every day. Without failures, you don't really learn anything, so it's important to embrace them. So what is a penetration test? There's a lot of people that have different opinions on what a penetration test is. There are some organizations out there who create vulnerability scanners who consider themselves penetration testers because they go in and they run a vulnerability scanner and they have a report with 5 million items that you need to fix because those are issues in your organization. I look at penetration testing as actually measuring the amount of risk that those vulnerabilities represent and also looking at how exploitable they are. I've seen some penetration testing reports that are reporting on issues that are on a one-off machine that can't possibly compromise any data in the organization, and it's just like, why even write this down? If it's not, there's always going to be more pressing matters to deal with than a system that's just sitting in the corner and its only job is to control a display board. That's not something that's really worthwhile going after. Then there's also threat emulation, which is sort of a step before what's considered red teaming, in my opinion. That's where you're trying to emulate either nation-state attackers or any sort of malicious entities out there, ransomware, the crypto miners, anyone that would be trying to compromise a system and do anything negative to it. The big difference between threat emulation, penetration testing, and red teaming, in my opinion, is red teaming is really focused on the training component. It's all about having a competent blue team that you're testing as a red teamer to make sure that they're able to detect and react to the actions you're taking. Without the training element, then it's just threat emulation and not really a red teaming exercise. So frustration is very good. It's something that should be embraced. It can be good and it can be bad. A lot of times, lately, this presentation was spawned out of bad frustration, and that bad frustration is every organization I go to does the same bad things, and so it's rinse and repeat, do the same penetration test over and over, and report the same findings, and no one seems to really be moving forward. So I want to create good frustration. I want organizations to address these issues so that I'm forced out of my comfort zone and have to actually push a little more, come up with new techniques and tactics, and do more than just run the same tools over and over again. So the current state of penetration testing is basically get on a network, and by lunchtime day one, you have domain admin, and then you're asking the organization, well, what is it you guys do so that we can actually show impact in this report? And you get answers anywhere from nothing important to we control financial records for like 20% of the world. And the ones that say nothing important are always hilarious because they're running critical systems for local governments, state governments, federal. One guy we were like, what's a critical system that you have here that people rely on? He's like, I really don't think anyone would notice if we went away. I'm like, you're the local government. I think someone would notice. Like, something would go wrong. But he was also the head of security who did not have an internet connection at home. So he was a little distant from the field. So how do we get domain admin so easily all the time? So there's a couple different techniques that we use that are fairly reliable, and we're going to go through each of them. Phishing, lack of basic cyber hygiene is something that still shocks me to this day. Password hashes, if you're dealing with a Active Directory environment, password hashes are flying all over the place, and a lot of people don't realize it. And then there's a lot of Active Directory misconfigurations that we often take advantage of, and it seems like every time we brief defenders about the issues, they're not even aware of the tooling we're using or that these issues are out there. So phishing is one of those things that it always works. I've had one assessment out of that 50 plus where phishing didn't work, and that was because it was a 10-person organization, and as soon as the first phishing email came in, they stood up and everyone else was in the room and they said, don't click on that. That's really the only time phishing doesn't work. If you're talking about a really large organization, phishing's always gonna work. There's just too many people, and there's also what I like to call the super clicker, and in every organization, once you get over about 25 people, there is one person who will click on anything that comes into their inbox. Doesn't matter what it is. And really, we can't blame them for that because a lot of people, their job is to read email and react to it. So they've been trained their whole time working there, like, you have to read those emails, you have to click on it, find out what it's about, and then do whatever it says. And if a bad guy sends one and they do it, they're just doing their job. It's not their fault that they got tricked. So two of the main goals when we do phishing campaigns is we're either phishing to get credentials so that we can get into the environment, or we're phishing to gain access to the environment. A lot of times we focus more on gaining access, but as more and more organizations are moving to the cloud, using Office 365, things like that, just getting their credentials to be able to gain access to their inboxes, their OneDrive, any of that stuff is actually more important than compromising the system that they're running it on, because they may not even have a domain that they're tied into. When phishing for access, the testing of payloads, it's really about figuring out what kind of environment you're getting into. We've had organizations that are still running Windows 7 throughout the entire organization, and it is a much different phishing attack against a Windows 7 system, then Windows 10 with up-to-date Defender is actually really hard to get payloads working on. I've tested a payload with a customer, worked just fine. 6 hours later, their definition's updated, and that did not work anymore. So moving to the newest stuff is definitely helpful. So here's an example of a Office 365 credential stealing website. So one of the big things to notice is you see the lock in the corner? Back in the day, all the training was look for the lock, look for the lock. If you see the lock, then you know you're on a safe website. Well, when Let's Encrypt came out, that advice sort of went out the window and is no longer applicable. Every single infrastructure we set up when we conduct assessments is always fully SSL TLS encrypted with a Let's Encrypt certificate. So everyone can get that, every bad guy can get that, and definitely, even back in the day, nation states or well-funded actors could easily get those as well because it was just an additional cost. But now there's not even any additional cost to it. It's free. So how do you protect those credentials? One of the things that was in the previous talk that I 100% agree with is password managers. Password managers are really good because they can identify the domain and they won't even give you the option to autofill because it's like, that's not Office 365. We're not going to show your creds. You are going to still run into situations where if someone doesn't understand how that password manager works and they're just forced to use it, they may copy and paste the credentials out of the password manager right into there. That's always going to be an issue. That one, you really just got to stick with user education to get around that. And then even with a password manager should have multi-factor authentication, and any internet-facing login page for an organization should have multi-factor authentication if possible. If it can't, I highly recommend putting it behind a VPN that has multi-factor authentication. We definitely see a lot of times on assessments customers that are still running with Outlook web access, just facing the internet. Anyone can log in. They have no multi-factor authentication on it. So if we phish for credentials, we can immediately just get right into their Outlook web access and start moving around, looking at emails, jumping into different users' inboxes. So this is an example of a phishing email that we use all the time and has great success. I would say we get anywhere from 7 to 20% click rate sending this phishing email with a link to a malicious payload. We have run into some problems. One time we phished an organization that was a union organization, and because we were telling them to do something without getting authorization, there were union grievances filed against management that had brought us in. So that's one thing to watch out for when phishing organizations. Make sure you're not violating any union rules when you send a phishing email. So when you're attaching payloads, I say attaching payloads, when you're linking payloads, I don't know that anyone actually attaches payloads anymore because everyone knows that most mail filters are going to scan those attachments and look for any malicious content within them. It's way easier to just put a link and rely on their IDS that's never going to see anything to try and block it. So a lot of the common payloads, Office macros still work. Anyone, if you're targeting anyone in the financial department, odds are they have macros enabled because most of their workflow is macro based. HTML applications, HTA documents, these are just heaven right now. They work so well. If an organization's using Internet Explorer, it cuts out so many steps. All they get is one prompt saying, are you sure you want to run this? They click OK, and we're off to the races. There's also a whole set of scripts, the Living Off the Land Binaries project, tons of awesome built-in Windows services and functions that can execute payloads, or you can even use some of them to pass hashes out by trying to authenticate to a server that you've stood up on the internet. So as far as stopping payloads, there's a lot of different ways to go about this. if you're running Windows 10 and some of the latest feature updates, the attack surface reduction rules are really amazing because they stop Office programs from spawning child processes. So if someone's running, using a phishing payload that's a macro, usually what's going to happen is that Office document, either Word or Excel, sometimes even Microsoft Access files, they're going to execute a macro that's going to spawn a either command.exe or PowerShell.exe child process underneath it. With attack surface reduction turned on, that's no longer possible. So that helps mitigate a lot of those macro-based attacks right there. Another thing is changing file type associations. So I said that HTAs are amazing. They work all the time. The reason they work so well is because HTA file types in Internet Explorer are automatically associated with the MSHTA executable, so they're going to run automatically. I have been to an organization before that actually associated HTA files with Notepad, so it just opened them up in Notepad so that the user could view them, and that immediately took out that whole swath of payloads that we typically use. So you can push that out as a GPO. Once again, one of the major things to first figure out is find out if you're using HTAs within your organization before pushing that out, because the last thing you want to do is push that out and find out that, oh, we just broke a bunch of stuff. Because I know that like when you download and install Chrome, I believe they use an HTA to launch that little downloader program that they use. But yeah, you can push out a GPO, you can modify the registry on individual systems. So on to the lack of cyber hygiene. So this is something that we see in large and small organizations. There's just a lot of things that people are still not doing. So a lot of people talk about the CIS security controls, and everyone talks about penetration testing, red teaming, all these cool, awesome things. And guess what? That's like the last step. Organizations should be doing a lot more before engaging in pen testing and red teaming. And I don't think I've been to an organization that has mastered step numbers 1 and 2. People always have stuff on their network that they're like, I have no idea where that is or what that is. We actually scanned a network probably 2 years ago, and I was like, oh, this must be a false positive because it says there's a Windows NT system on the network, and there's no way you guys still have a Windows NT box on the network. And the guy's face just went ghost white, and he was like, someone forgot to unplug that. And he took us down to the basement and showed us where it was sitting there in their data center. And I was like, I can't believe this is still running. But tons of organizations have no idea what's running on their network. A lot of times when they bring us in to do pen testing, one of the key things they want is they want that Nmap report showing all the systems that are on their network, because they don't even know. When you get a scope from a customer, they're like, do this whole /8 because I don't know what's out there and I want to find out. And so we spend a lot of time just scanning empty swaths of network because they're not sure if something's there or not. What was that? I mean, almost everything I'm mentioning in here, people can do themselves, but people pay for services so they don't have to do it. I pay for someone to come and clean up my dog's poop because it's something I could do myself, but I'd rather pay someone else to do it. So one of the major issues we see with lack of cyber hygiene is people are putting stuff on the network without modifying the defaults at all. They're just like, plug that into the network and we're good to go. Like, or one of the big problem children of default installs are developers, because they love to spin up CMS systems and web servers by just next, finish, keep all the defaults. I just want to make sure that this page is working. Okay, it's working, deploy it, and forget to uninstall everything. So now you've got Cold Fusion, whatever, all of them are vulnerable to something because that's Cold Fusion, so it's now sitting on your network even though it isn't being used to host anything. You see things like Jenkins, Tomcat, all these things with default credentials. Every time I search for a printer or a network device, Google automatically puts default password as the guess as to what I'm going to search for, because that's what I do. Is I get on a network, I scan, find everything that's out there, anything that has an HTTP or HTTPS port, I put into a tool like Eyewitness or Aquatone, and they go through and take screenshots of all of those pages. Then I go through each of those screenshots and I go, okay, what's this? Let's check, see if default credentials work. Most of the time they do. Printers, no one changes the default credentials on printers because they don't want to have to deal with telling someone what it is if there's a printer problem, because printers are always causing problems. I've actually gotten domain administrator from a printer because they had the printer tied into Active Directory with domain administrator credentials so that they could scan their documents to whoever's user folder they needed to. So they had to give it domain administrator credentials. It just made it so easy. But once you go into the configuration, you can then point it at a new IP address and test the connection. And this one wasn't even sending a hash password. It just sent clear text passwords. So you just sniff traffic and here's clear text domain administrator credentials. That one was a lot of fun because the customer was a jerk about everything. Like, they had network access controls on. So we were like, oh, can you turn that off so we can plug in and start scanning? And they were like, you're the hackers, figure it out. So we just cloned one of their printer's MAC addresses and got on the network. And then we were like, do you guys want an authenticated vulnerability scan as part of this? Because a lot of organizations don't have Nessus, and we're like, we'll give you an authenticated vulnerability scan. It's yours to keep. Like, we don't really do anything with it. We don't use it as part of our attack path. And they were like, yeah, that'd be good. We were like, okay, like, do you want to just type in the password that you want to use to authenticate for this scan? And they're like, no, you guys are the hackers, figure it out. And so like 5 minutes later, I was like, oh, we're doing that, that vulnerability scan with your domain admin cred, so don't worry about it, we got it. And the last bullet point here, we're always looking for systems like I was talking about earlier, Cold Fusion, Jenkins, Tomcat, systems that can deploy and execute code and are usually running with very high privileges on the system. So usually if we find one of these without credentials or with default credentials, it's one step away from us fully compromising that system. And then once we have system level access, that enables things like stealing clear text passwords, password hashes, and moving around the network, which we'll get into in a little bit. So patching, still an issue to this day in almost every organization. A lot of organizations are starting to get Windows patching under control, but they're still failing at a lot of other patching. There's so many outdated, I think I saw ESX4 running recently. That's really old at this point and has a ton of vulnerabilities in it. People don't really have a strategy for patching any of their Linux or Unix systems still. Mainframes, who patches their mainframe? Haven't seen that very often. And then we've seen some organizations that are actually, they claim they're too big to patch. I went into an organization and it was about a year after MS 1710, and we scanned and looked around and we were like, okay, you have like 250 instances of systems vulnerable to MS 1710, and they're like, but we're at 95% patch level, so we're good. Like, could you please take this critical down to a high because we can't get to the rest of them? And I was like, no, that's your problem, not mine. Like, I can't imagine running an organization and just being like, yeah, we'll just let these vulnerable systems just float around and just call it a unsolvable problem. And then the last point, it's important to patch things like user workstations because they're going to constantly be going out to websites, they're going to be getting emails. Any vulnerability that's within any of the browsers are critical to get patched on user workstations because they're at the most threat to being exploited by those. Your servers, you want to patch them, but it's not as critical to patch them right away because your server should not, people shouldn't be browsing the internet from servers. People do, but they shouldn't. So they're not as critical to patch right away, but there are systems that you just can't patch. There's industrial control systems that are running on Windows XP and are unable to be patched. And the key there is isolating them. There's always multiple ways to solve problems in security. I think that's one of the things that I love and I'm sure everyone else loves is it's like a puzzle. there's the simple solution to just patch everything, and then there's the more complicated solution of finding ways to secure that device without relying on patching. And that's anything from firewalling it off to isolating it from the network completely on a air-gapped network, or just accepting the fact that there's always going to be risk and heavily monitoring that system so that when something does happen, you're alerted and you can react quickly. So one of the things we see very often, we've seen organizations who have been hit with ransomware. They've been hit with crypto miners or even just disk wipers. And the first thing that happens is, as we're seeing with Baltimore, there's a massive increase in budget all of a sudden. They're going to go out and they're going to buy everything they can. They think that they're going to be able to just buy security by putting a bunch of boxes out there, and that's going to help protect them. But the reality is, if you don't have the basics covered, then the blinky boxes, they're not going to do anything for you. We had a customer we did that had gone through ransomware, they'd recovered, they'd spent millions and millions of dollars in order to secure their network. Almost every host, every workstation in their environment was basically a malware analysis box. They had multiple endpoint defense products on there, all this stuff, but they still, like, they were catching all the typical stuff, our HTAs, things like that, they were getting caught. But the problem was, because they had so much stuff on there, they increased their surface area that they're at risk of being attacked on. And some of those security products required the installation of supporting software. So every one of their workstations had Perl and Python installed on it. So then we just used a payload based in Perl, and we were just fine. And they thought for sure they had everything locked down. They were like, we're not seeing anything, you guys are dead in your tracks. And we were just like, yeah, your network was fully compromised again, and if we wanted to, could have put ransomware everywhere, just like the last people. No, I mean, the big sources of ransomware are going to be HTAs, executables that are then using some stuff we're going to get into later, like local administrator password issues. A lot of times are what they're taking advantage of. There are some that take advantage of exploits like MS-1710, but those are more rare. It's usually taking advantage of security misconfigurations. We'll talk. There's another section on local administrator issues. So it is interesting now that Microsoft actually has Python in the Microsoft Store. There's a lot of stuff going on with the Windows subsystem for Linux, Python being, like, Microsoft is now the open source darling. Like, there's the era of Linux on the desktop is here thanks to Windows. But it's going to be interesting to see how attacker tactics develop based on that, because I could see having a Linux system within a Windows environment as an attacker sounds wonderful. I would love to have a PowerShell one-liner on a compromised Windows system to download and install Kali right there on that box and hide the window and give me access to it so I can SSH into it. Then I can have all my tools on site and I don't have to worry about bringing stuff in. So it's a lot of stuff that I think the research is very young on. There hasn't been a whole lot, especially because the Windows subsystem for Linux just got a lot better in the latest feature update. So you can now actually run Nmap, whereas before you couldn't really interact with the network interfaces. So I don't think, I'm not aware of Python or Perl being used in ransomware attacks. It's typically just standard Windows execution of programs. Stuxnet, I'm not 100% familiar on everything. I mean, that was targeting industrial control system and also was layered up with zero-day exploits. So it's a bit of an outlier. The standard ransomware is as complicated as it needs to be to get the job done and no more. So as I was saying, less attack surface is huge. Some of these products just increase the amount of issues you're going to have on your network. you are deploying an endpoint agent to every one of your systems. And guess what? If that gets compromised, I can now deploy code on every one of those endpoints as well. If you're familiar with McAfee's ePolicy, EPO, we have used that to push code out to every single system checking in on that network. In the last line there, marketers are not security engineers. So they'll tell you whatever you want to hear to make that sale, but the reality is much different. And just because something's capable of preventing certain attacks doesn't mean its default configured state is able to. That the guy who didn't have the internet that I was talking about earlier, who's the head of security, they had a very expensive product in their network, but they didn't have the budget to afford training for it. So they got it plugged in, and then it just sat there, and they didn't know what to do with it because no one was able to get trained on it. So that's really just a waste of money at that point. You're better off hiring a person as opposed to spending the money on a blinky box, because a person can Google, a person can go on GitHub and pull down projects and look at implementing them. A box can't do any of that. So, some of the solutions for dealing with those problems. A lot of times, you need to let executives know that there's certain exploits like the Blue Keep one that's out there right now. There's no POC that I'm aware of that's publicly available, but it is a remotely exploitable RDP vulnerability. And anyone who has, first off, don't put RDP on the internet. Just don't do it. Put it behind a VPN and VPN in and then RDP. But people have done that. But you need to stress to executives management that this is a big deal, because as soon as a public POC does come out, if someone in your network, in the network gets exploited with phishing or drive-by download, anything like that, every system inside the network that has that vulnerability still present is probably going to get ransomware installed on it. So when you're dealing with the systems that have default passwords and or no passwords, it's important that you have some sort of system validation process before anything can even be plugged into your network. All of that configuration should be done before it's put on the network. Too often people are like, okay, let's get this on the network, get it up and running, and we'll worry about securing it later. And later never happens. It just sits there. It probably changes hands to the point where no one even knows who the system owner is anymore, and it's just a relic sitting there. There's countless systems we've run into that as soon as we notified the POC, they just went and turned it off because they were like, oh yeah, we don't even need that. I don't know why that's still on our network. And then if you want a guide to improving your cyber hygiene, the CIS controls are an amazing first couple steps to get you going. If you take care of the top 5, you're doing better than like 80% of the organizations I've seen. And the last point, hire people, not boxes. So password hashes. This is an issue that has really become huge with ransomware because people are taking advantage of this to spread ransomware once they get inside an organization. So here's just a quick rundown of some of the tools we use. Responder is our #1 tool. It's been winning us DA on assessments for the past couple years really quickly. I just was on an assessment this past week, and Responder was really the only thing that was working because they had their patching under control. They had a well-segmented network, so we actually were having a hard time moving around, but Responder was great at grabbing all of those hashes that were running around out there, and their password policy was horrible. So for those who don't know how Responder works, Responder, as the name implies, responds. So it sits on the network, it stands up a bunch of different services, and so by default, it'll just sit on the network and just do analysis of what's going on around it. But if anyone tries to connect to you on any of the ports that it's running, like it's running SMB, HTTP, HTTPS, FTP, SSH, and it's just capturing any authentication requests that people make to it. One time I was actually running Nessus and Responder on the same box, and we had a guy with us on the team who was didn't typically work on the team. He was just trying to like follow along and see how we work. And he went to log into Nessus, and I got all excited because all of a sudden I saw like new password captured, and I was like, oh, awesome. And I look and I was like, who just put our Nessus password into Responder? Because Responder will grab any password you put into it. And when you go to the HTTP site, it's just a default login page. So anyway, Responder, once it's on the network, it's running its services, and then it's listening for requests for systems that aren't present in DNS. So when you're requesting a share, you're going to ask the DNS server, like, hey, what's the IP for this share? I want to go connect to it and get my files. And DNS server says, I don't know, it's not in my records, and I wasn't able to retrieve it from any of the records that I looked up. So then your box goes, okay, let's use LLMNR, link local, blanking on the name. Link local multi-name resolution, multicast name resolution, or NetBIOS name resolution. And so what that's going to do is it's going to broadcast that to your local subnet on the broadcast address. It's going to go, hey, does anyone have this address? Because I'm really looking to connect to this share. And Responder sits on the network and goes, yep, that's me. Connect to me. I've got your files. And that person is going to send an SMB request to mount that share, and we're going to get that password hash. Now, the nice thing is once you grab that password hash, there's a lot of different things you can do with it. If the organization has SMB signing disabled, you can just relay that password hash right along to another system. So we'll set up Responder, we'll use either NTLM relay or multi-relay, and as soon as we get a password hash, a lot of times we'll look to see if like the domain controller or file server, somewhere where a couple users might have sessions, or have SMB signing disabled, and we'll try and relay password hashes over to them. The other thing, you now have this captured password hash, so you can start cracking it. If an organization has a password policy that enables them to have less than 8 characters or less, like an 8-character password in the entire space of possible passwords can be cracked in a day with a GPU-based password cracking rig. A lot of organizations still don't even have a password policy requiring 8 characters. The one I was just at had no requirement on length. So you could have any password. I've seen a lot that are 7 still. Some have had 4 characters, which 4 characters, I can run Hashcat in a VM and crack that password. So once you've gotten that, that password and passed it around, if you find a system where they're a local administrator, you have a system level privileges on that box, which enables you to do all kinds of fun stuff. So some of the ways to stop Responder, first off, disable LLMNR and NetBIOS name resolution. They're old protocols that you don't really need anymore. If people are trying to connect to shares on your network, it should be in your DNS server. If it's not, people shouldn't be connecting to it. Enable SMB signing. So SMB signing is great because then we can't relay that password and gain a connection. It basically hashes the hash almost with each connection. So that way it's a unique connection that we can't get in between and be in the middle of. And then disabling NTLM is probably getting to be a good idea at this point. We just had some major vulnerabilities in NTLM where even enabling SMB signing didn't do anything because if you sent the right packet, it was just like, okay, I'll skip that check and still let you relay this hash. I mean, he's asking if disabling NTLM has impact in a modern enterprise. If you're able to do full Kerberos authentication for everything and not use NTLM, then you're doing pretty good. But you are going to have some of those organizations that have legacy systems that don't fully support Kerberos authentication. Like I still see Windows 2000 boxes out there that people are using because a lot of election infrastructure requires Windows 2000 boxes because vendors don't upgrade stuff. Yeah, exactly. Like if you are keeping your systems up to date and you're running a full Windows 10 environment, Server 2016 or above, then you should have no impact disabling NTLM. The only issues are going to be depending on how you interact with printers. Printers sometimes they want old school authentication, so if you have printers that you're authenticating to, that could be an issue. And then there's a handful of legacy devices or older devices that maybe you have an old network attached storage device that isn't fully updated. A lot of network attached storage devices are still running SMB v1, so that's a disaster, but you have that issue with old stuff. But that's why you really, before disabling it, you need to investigate and make sure you can disable it. So test first and disable it on your own system before disabling it on a user system, because the last thing you want to do is knock them out. So there are additional things to consider that Responder is capable of doing. So IPv6, there's a great way to run a tool called man-in-the-middle IPv6, man-in-the-middle 6. What it does is it spins up a IPv6 network and gives Windows hosts on the same subnet IPv6 addresses and says that I'm the DNS server. Windows, by default, prioritizes IPv6 networks over IPv4 networks. So now you get all those DNS requests first. So if you want to tell them you're the system they're trying to connect to, you can do that with IPv6. And that way you don't have to use LLMNR or NetBIOS name resolution. So if you don't have an IPv6 network, it's probably a good idea to disable IPv6 on your Windows systems. Yeah, exactly. Like, hands up in the room, who's running internal IPv6 right now? That's why the meme's there. But so there's also WPAD, which is a automatic proxy configuration. Windows has had problems with WPAD for a very long time, and there are still organizations that don't have all the updates. So with WPAD, when a system connects to the network, it's going to request from the DNS server the WPAD configuration. If the DNS server doesn't have a WPAD configuration, Responder can say, here's your WPAD configuration. Now all your browsing sessions are coming through me. And then anytime they go to access a resource, I can pop up a password box and make them put in a password. You can definitely take out a network with that configuration, though, so be careful with that one. And then there's always good old-fashioned ARP poisoning to get in between hosts and force traffic through you. So Active Directory misconfigurations, there's a ton of them. We're getting low on time, so I'm gonna go through this a little quickly. So these are the top tools that I'm using when I'm evaluating someone's Active Directory configuration. Bloodhound is amazing. It's probably the greatest defenders tool that I only know of attackers using. I know very few defenders that are actually using it, but if I went into an organization and they had run Bloodhound and trimmed out all of the ability to get their domain admins, like, I would run it and just be like, what is going on here? I have been in an environment that Microsoft themselves configured, and it was an absolute nightmare. It was just like, there's no way to actually move around in here because, funny enough, Microsoft knows how to configure Active Directory, but it costs a pretty penny. So one of the big issues is users with local administrator privileges. I've seen this. I went to an organization, giant financial organization, and every single user in there was a local admin. And I was like, what are you guys doing right now? And the security people were like, we know, but there's nothing we can do about it, because the users go to their management and go, I bring in $8 billion a quarter and I want to install Spotify, so give me my local admin access. And the manager says, he brings in $8 billion? Yeah, give him Spotify, let's do it. But there's no reason that you don't just include Spotify on your base image so that everyone has it, and then they don't need to be local administrator. So a lot of the reasons for people being local administrator is just because you haven't found the problem that they need local administrator access to solve. So figure out why they need it and then get rid of it. The same local administrator account across organizations, you see this, usually it's split in two. So there's one local administrator account for servers because they're all deployed from one base image of a server operating system, and there's one local administrator account across all user workstations because they're using that same image everywhere. When this happens, this is where ransomware runs wild, because as soon as it gets local administrator on one box, it's able to dump hashes or dump clear text credentials using Mimikatz, or any tool has the ability to dump hashes, like with Metasploit. I use Cobalt Strike all the time. And once you get that hash, you can then use pass the hash to just send that everywhere, and you have system level access on every box, and ransomware would definitely have a good time with that. So, stopping lateral movement. So both of those issues enable attackers to move laterally within the network. Microsoft has a tool called Lapse, and what it does is it sets a randomized local administrator password and then stores it within Active Directory so that you can lock down who has rights to access that password. So you can give the help desk local administrator passwords if you have some reason to give the help desk that access. But the nice thing is that it's randomized, and it can update on its own and change the password often so that it keeps rotating. Disable remote local admin access. There's a lot of organizations that are running it, and it's like, why do you even need remote local administrator access? There's no reason, because everyone's within one building. If they have a problem, you just walk to their computer and log in. You don't need to be able to enable someone to do it over the network. And then I've not been on a network that I can think of where they actually enabled the Windows firewall, but it's a great way to stop people from moving around. Users don't need to talk to other users. Users need to talk to servers, and users need to talk to the internet sometimes, but they don't have any reason to talk to each other. And so you shouldn't have Workstation 1 connecting to an SMB share on Workstation 2. The SMB share should be on your file server, not on their system. So if you actually turn on the Windows firewall, block users from talking to each other, correction, I said I never saw it. I saw it one time, and I am now remembering how much I hated it, because it was just like, I can't move, like, fished a user on the box and can't go anywhere. So we were just locked in place at that point. There's a couple other issues to look for in Active Directory. So trusts are a big one. I've seen organizations, mergers and acquisitions, create Active Directory nightmares, because what they do is they take that other organization and they just create a trust and just merge them together. And they're like, all right, good to go. And so you're inheriting any attacker that's inside that network is now inside your network that you've just merged with. And it becomes a nightmare of actually figuring out who's where and what users are logged in where. When you run Bloodhound, you can actually map the trusts, and you can get some really interesting maps with large organizations. And you can look for users who are in foreign groups that are logged into the network that you're currently in, which can create some interesting things as well, where you're like, wait, where's this person coming from? DC Sync and DC Shadow. So with Mimikatz, you can basically pretend to be a domain controller and then ask the domain controller for password hashes. So as soon as we get like domain admin, we will DC sync a bunch of other domain admins, the enterprise admin, just to make sure we have access that's going to last for the entirety of the engagement. Password policies, as I was talking about earlier, organizations still have really bad password policies. If your password is under 12 characters, it's probably not a good password. Complexity doesn't matter. The latest guidance has said that complexity is not important, length is important. So the longer password you can create, the better. If you have a legacy environment, you're going to run into problems. If you use the Azure AD, you can create a 255 character password. If you're using Active Directory, odds are you can only have a 16 character password, because if you have legacy systems, they can't handle anything longer than that. My wife, at her previous job, she actually set a secure password because of being married to me, and security finally filtered down through all my communications. She set a super secure password and completely destroyed her account because the system couldn't handle it, and it truncated it, and it didn't even just truncate the end off, it truncated it some other way so that they couldn't recover the password. So got to look out for legacy systems that don't support that type of authentication. So key takeaways. So security is hard. It's not simple. We can't just flip a light switch and say, this network is secure, we're good to go. Businesses don't care about security because security doesn't make money. Security costs money. There's a handful of security businesses. The security IPO market this year has been very hot, so there are businesses making money on security, but the majority of businesses have another industry they're in outside of security. They make cars, they make services, anything like that. And the key with security is to just keep moving forward. Too many organizations and people just give up. They're like, we're never going to be secure, so why bother? But you can move forward a little bit every day. Make a couple small changes and slowly work your way up to being a more secure organization. Who wants a job? Who wants to be a pen tester? Because I'm hiring. So if you want to talk to me in the vendor area, I'll talk to you in the vendor area no matter what. But if you want a job, definitely talk to me in the vendor area, because we are hiring at SEI for penetration testers, especially if you want to do pen testing and you have some developer experience, because we're also doing a lot of development now and have some interesting things we're working on and would love to talk with you about that. I like to talk about security in general, so if you just want to talk about security, go ahead and reach out to me on any of these social media and whatnots. And last but not least, hack the planet. Thank you.